So, the Nanjing Decade ends with, effectively, the Japanese invasion of northern China in 1937, and then subsequently their invasion of southern China, beginning with Shanghai, Nanjing, Wuhan, in the years after that as well. So now we're going to talk about World War II, and then the ensuing civil war and communist victory that leads to the rise of the People's Republic of China in 1949. So, the Japanese invasion is ironic from many different perspectives. It achieved the exact opposite of what Japan's actual stated goals were. What did Japan broadcast to the world about why they were in China and what they were trying to do and why they were so hostile towards Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government? Well, they said they're going to rescue the Chinese people from communism. They said that Chiang Kai-shek isn't doing an effective job, and communism was sort of they were diametrically opposed to this ideology. They had a king, a monarchy, somewhat conservative. They were very hostile to the Soviet Union. We're going to rescue the Chinese people from communism. We're going to kick out what they referred to as the collaborationist Chiang Kai-shek and his imperialist sponsors. He's also not doing a good enough job getting rid of imperialism. Of course, the Japanese don't see themselves as imperialists themselves. They're different. We are Asian, so we're not imperialist. We're uplifting and helping all of our younger Asian brothers and liberating them from Western imperialism. And Chiang Kai-shek's doing a very poor job of this. In fact, he's doing the opposite. And we're going to protect Japanese interest in the Northeast, which is sort of our natural living space that we've expanded into, and managed to kick out Russian influence and negative Chinese backward influence as well. Instead, the Japanese invasion of China in 1937 leads to the rise, indirectly, of the Chinese Communist Party, who they were trying to say we did not want them to come to power. It leads to a closer American Nationalist Party alliance than before, because the Americans will intervene on the side of Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalist Party. Eventually, through their own defeat in World War II, it'll lead to preeminent Soviet influence throughout Northeast Asia, including the island of Sakhalin, just north of the Japanese four home islands. And it will lead to the loss of all the Japanese colonies that had been acquired since the Sino-Japanese War in 1895, most notably Taiwan, which was their first major imperialist acquisition in 1895. So when the Japanese invade China, it results in a quagmire. We've seen quagmires in many parts of the world. How did this come about? Well, the Japanese quagmire in China, was the result of Chiang Kai-shek fighting for his political life. Unlike before, now he really has to fight, okay? Heck, he was kidnapped the year before. His own generals kidnapped him because he wasn't fighting the Japanese. So of course now, the next time Japan has an outrage somewhere in the Northeast, this time it's going to be Beijing, he's going to fight, all right? He has no choice whatsoever. And he did, with his German-trained troops and his arms. And he puts up a terrific fight. The Japanese were not expecting this. They had no idea that the Chinese weren't going to be just pushovers who, surrendered in 2 weeks. Isn't that how all wars go? Everyone thinks we're going to invade Iraq, it's going to be over in 2 weeks, right? All wars are going to be 2-week wars, and they never are. All right, bloody battles for Shanghai. The Japanese are taken aback by how fiercely the Nationalist Party troops were able to resist them in Shanghai, and how excellent they were. Then Nanjing, the famous massacre in Nanjing. Wuhan, each one of these major cities along the Yangtze River, as the Nationalist Party retreats. The Japanese thought that the Chiang Kai-shek was going to, roll over and surrender. He wasn't going to keep fighting. No, Chiang Kai-shek says, we're just going to keep going inland. We have a huge empire. We're just going to go further and further into Asia until the Japanese can't reach us. And that's what they do. And they end up in the city of Chongqing, make that their wartime capital. The Americans begin to provide aid over the hump, over the Himalayas, reaching Chongqing. Japanese can sometimes airbomb the city of Chongqing, but they can't do much more than that. And they're not going to be able to defeat the Nationalist Party by traditional military means. Now, Chiang Kai-shek, for his part, also knew he couldn't really defeat Japan decisively, but he could absolutely fight them to a stalemate, while the United States and Britain and Australia and other, smaller nations as well, helped to defeat them in other theaters, like the Pacific Ocean. We're going to bog down the Japanese troops in China, fight them to a stalemate, while other more powerful empires like the United States and Britain are able to actually wage the decisive blow and take the battle to the Japanese home islands. Chiang Kai-shek knew he wasn't going to ever take the battle to the Japanese home islands themselves. One of those other theaters, besides the Pacific, was Burma, Southeast Asia, where the Japanese had invaded after Pearl Harbor in 1941 to 1942. Pearl Harbor was the beginning of the Japanese invasion of Southeast Asia, and the Burma theater is a great case study that shows how World War II led to the downfall of the Nationalist Party and the rise of the Chinese Communist Party. Unlike Mao Zedong, Chiang Kai-shek was the central government. He represented the legal central government of China, recognized by all other major states throughout the world. So unlike Mao Zedong in Yan'an, poor remote Yan'an, Chiang Kai-shek had to show commitment, a good faith commitment to the Allied cause. He couldn't not join the war against Japan. So he sent his best remaining German-trained troops and arms to fight the Japanese in Burma, where most of them were killed under terrible, indifferent American and British leadership that basically said, use the Chinese for cannon fodder and preserve the American and British and Indian troops who were also fighting on the British side as well. Meanwhile, life in the wartime capital of Chongqing was demoralizing. Despite the stalemate on the battlefield, Chiang Kai-shek still lost his base of support in the Yangtze River Delta in the east. That was his region where he could, train troops and have his own base of support, tax revenue. He loses all that. He loses all his hard-won gains against warlord autonomy because he again had to abandon his original base. He had chipped away at warlords and now that's all lost. He lost his best troops in battle because he really had to fight the Japanese as opposed to the Chinese communists who could hold back and not really fight them at all. And now he had to replace those best German-trained troops with new, raw, green peasant conscripts who often did not want to fight and they had no loyalty to Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Party at all. He also loses the internal party discipline and ideology that was at the heart of a Leninist party state. The nationalists, when they emerge from the war in 1945, even though technically they're on the winning side, they will be a hollow shell of their former selves, and they will be easily pushed aside by the communists and flee to Taiwan. Meanwhile, Mao's having a blast in Yan'an. He doesn't have to fight in World War II. Yes, they send their troops and do a few token battles. They realize, whoa, the Japanese are going to kick our ass, and they retreat, and they say, we're just going to have little skirmishes, guerrilla warfare. We're not going to, do suicide and go into direct land-based pitched battles with the Japanese. That's suicide. And hey, we're not the legal government of China. We're not the central government. We don't have to do that like Chiang Kai-shek has to do that. So Mao spends his time in Yan'an from 37 to 45 purging his internal rivals in the party, again, consolidating his own power, increasing party cohesion and discipline, ideological cohesion. He undertakes what's known as the Rectification Campaign from 1942 to 44, cracking down on all dissent, making sure this is the rise of the cult of Mao and his really, absolutist powers in the party, his cult of personality that he can use to overthrow any dissent in the party. That'll have horrible consequences in the 1950s and 60s when he draws upon his cult of personality in order to steamroll over any opposition in the party for terrible policies that he wants to pursue. He'll crack down on literary dissent, so this is the boundaries of what you can write short fiction about, and films and whatnot. This is what you can and can't do. The censorship is in place. The nationalists can't afford to implement that level of censorship. There's a lot more plurality of opinion in the Nationalist Party at this same time period, and they see the party membership balloon to 1 million people. They're flourishing. It's much easier to recruit people into the Communist Party in the North than in the South. The landlords are much weaker in the North as well, and the CCP hardly fought at all. Instead, they got great media press from visiting Americans who came from Chongqing, depressing wartime capital, where they say, wow, the GMD is crumbling here, how depressing and demoralizing this is. They'd fly to Yan'an for a few days to meet Mao. They'd be feted and feasted, and everyone's happy and whatnot. The Americans come back after a week. They're like, wow, the communists are great. They represent a much more vigorous future for China, not really seeing what Mao was doing and his methods and what was really going on. It was a very skewed image of what the Chinese communists were actually like. By 1945, when the war is over, everyone knows that civil war is going to break out again. And when it does, the Americans support the Nationalist Party while the Soviets back the CCP. Despite appearances to the contrary, however, the war is a laugher. The warlords, who Chiang Kai-shek has only superficially incorporated into the Nationalist Party, they begin to defect. There's no ideological cohesion there. They've been disaffected already by their time in the wartime capital in Chongqing, a very depressing place to be. No money, inflation, Japanese air raids, not nearly the level of optimism and sense of progress that's going on in Yan'an under the Chinese Communists. Even loyal Nationalist Party officers begin to defect in 1947, 48, and 49. They defect to the Chinese Communists. Some of his military officers just outright disobey his orders to fight in the field, and they flee from Chinese Communist armies. And this enrages the United States, who's, the U.S. congressmen are looking at this and saying, that $400 million that we earmarked for munitions support and tanks to the nationalists, they're not even fighting. Their officers in the field are retreating and abandoning this. We're basically provisioning the Chinese communists with U.S. arms because the nationalists aren't even really using them on the battlefield. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union is helping the Chinese communists consolidate their base of power in Manchuria. Manchuria shares a border with the Soviet Union, very convenient. It's also the industrial powerhouse of East Asia because of Japan. Manchuria was where Japan had its main colonial base foothold on the East Asian mainland, and they industrialized it. They developed it. Now it's the industrial powerhouse, far more industrially advanced than any other part of China, and the CCP has it with Soviet help. By 1948, the rout is on. The nationalists and Chiang Kai-shek flee to Taiwan, intending to make their last stand. Eventually, the communists would have invaded, and they would have eventually destroyed the Nationalist Party and taken over Taiwan. It was only a matter of time. The U.S. said we were ready to abandon Chiang Kai-shek. We're fed up with the Nationalist Party. Only the outbreak of the Korean War convinced the United States that, hey, it would be useful to have a Chinese state that is separate from the communists, and we can advertise it as sort of free China, just like you have a South Korea, a South Vietnam. This is going to be sort of like a South China, the Republic of China on Taiwan, and the U.S. then commits to it as a result of the Korean War. Prior to the Korean War in June 1950, they were ready to abandon Chiang Kai-shek and let the communists take over Taiwan. CCP wins in 1949. And not only were they able to benefit from the Japanese invasion, that's why they won. They won because the Japanese effectively destroyed the nationalists. Even though they didn't technically win, they effectively destroyed them, so they were a shell of themselves. By 1949, the CCP not only sees the nationalists are crumbling before them, it's not even really a fight, they also have the luxury of no more foreign imperialists eroding their political legitimacy like Chiang Kai-shek, Yuan Shikai, and the Qing imperial emperors had experienced before them. World War II has gotten rid of Japan, and the other imperialists are gone as well. A new era has dawned. The CCP now gets to see what they can do on the supposedly blank slate of China in 1949. This takes us to the Mao years.